The land lay fractured, its once glorious banners now tattered remnants of a forgotten peace. The war had left scars deeper than the eye could see, turning noble houses into bitter rivals, each clawing for control. Roads that once carried merchants and wandering minstrels now bore the weight of armored riders and desperate exiles. In the shadow of burned-out villages, whispers of lost identity haunted those who had seen their homes swallowed by fire. And yet, amidst the ruins, the code of honor still held sway, binding warriors and wanderers alike to unspoken oaths. Among the chaos, the roads belonged to no one and yet threatened everyone. Mercenaries roamed in search of coin, some bound by forced alliances, others seeking only blood and plunder. Travelers kept their heads low, their hands never straying far from their blades, knowing that a single glance could be mistaken for provocation. In the dim glow of distant torches, caravans trudged forward, their owners praying the night would pass without an ambush. Compassion had become a luxury few could afford, yet even in the harsh wilderness, some clung to the remnants of humanity. In the end, survival was not just about strength but about knowing when to fight and when to fade into the shadows. For those of noble birth, the world had changed beyond recognition. Castles once teeming with life now stood hollow, their courtyards emptied of laughter and song. The old order was crumbling, giving way to something far more ruthless, where titles meant little unless backed by steel. Even among knights, brotherhood had turned brittle, shattered by the weight of shifting allegiances. The battlefield had no place for hesitation. Either one honored the silent bond of loyalty or was cut down by those who no longer did. In such a world, trust was earned not by words, but by the willingness to bleed for another. The Maiden knew this all too well, having watched her own house fall from grace. The war had left her with little more than a name and a promise whispered by a dying father. Forced into the open roads, she carried nothing but the weight of an uncertain future. She had no illusions of safety, for even the most righteous were not spared the cruelty of desperate men. In a world that thrived on conflict, a lone traveler was either prey or bait, unless she found a way to become something else entirely. The answer lay in the strength of an outstretched hand, or the steel of an unsheathed blade. Her protector, a knight sworn to her cause, understood this reality far too well. He had witnessed the depths to which men could sink when hope faded and desperation took hold. He did not fight for a kingdom nor for glory, but for something far simpler, a duty not yet fulfilled. In his eyes, the path ahead was clear. Keep her safe, no matter the cost. But even the most steadfast warriors knew that survival was never guaranteed, and as the road stretched before them, the looming specter of betrayal was never far behind. With each step, the danger grew, pressing upon them like the weight of an unseen hand. The kingdom was no longer ruled by laws but by whispers in the dark, where the price of loyalty could change with the clink of a single coin. And as they neared the outskirts of a nameless village, a dimly lit tavern beckoned, a place where the weary could rest, but where trust was a fleeting illusion.
If you like exciting medieval stories, you can help us by subscribing, activating the bell, and leaving your like.
The tavern was a refuge in name only. Its wooden beams bore the weight of countless drunken quarrels, and the air reeked of stale ale and unspoken threats. The Maiden and her knightly protector stepped inside, their presence like a spark near dry tinder. The room was filled with mercenaries, deserters, and spies, each bound by silent bonds of mistrust. Eyes flickered toward them, some curious, others calculating. A lone traveler meant little, but a guarded maiden in times of turmoil? That was an invitation for trouble. They took a seat in the farthest corner, the knight positioning himself between her and the crowd. The murmurs in the room ebbed and flowed, shifting with the weight of hidden agendas. A game of power was always in motion, even in a place as unremarkable as this. Compassion had no place in such gatherings, only leverage. And in the shadows of that dimly lit room, unseen forces were already moving, setting the stage for a clash neither of them had foreseen. A drunk nobleman, his coat bearing the insignia of a fallen house, staggered toward them. His words were slurred, but his intent was clear. He recognized the Maiden's lineage, the bloodline that once ruled where his now lay in ashes. There was no loyalty left in his voice, only bitterness and greed. A forced alliance, he sneered, is still an alliance. Perhaps you should choose new company before someone chooses for you. His laughter was cut short by the scrape of steel against wood. The knight's hand rested on his blade, the meaning unmistakable. The moment shattered like glass. A rival faction, hidden among the patrons, seized the opportunity. Swords were drawn, chairs overturned, and the tavern became a battlefield. The maiden barely had time to react before the first blow was struck. The knight moved with precision, each strike a testament to years of battle. The code of honor meant little here, only survival mattered. But against sheer numbers, even skill had its limits. Amidst the chaos, she felt a grip on her wrist, rough, insistent. A mercenary, seizing his chance, sought to drag her away into the unknown. Fear surged through her, but so did something else, resolve. She reached for the nearest weapon, a dagger abandoned on the table, and drove it forward. The mercenary recoiled, startled by her defiance. This was no helpless maiden. This was someone who understood what it meant to fight for her own fate. The knight reached her side, blood staining his armor. The fight was unwinnable. More soldiers were spilling into the tavern, drawn by the commotion. Their escape was their only hope. With a final strike, he carved a path through the chaos, pulling her toward the back exit. The night air hit them like a slap, cold, urgent, full of unspoken warnings. They ran, leaving behind the scent of blood and betrayal. The open road awaited them once more, but the wilderness ahead held dangers of its own. The forest swallowed them whole, its towering trees forming a cathedral of shadows and silence. The night was merciless, stretching endlessly as they pressed deeper into the unknown. Every branch that snapped beneath their feet felt like a warning, every rustling leaf a whispered threat. The maiden's breath came in uneven bursts, her body still trembling from the battle left behind. The knight moved ahead, scanning the darkness, his every step guided by instinct. In this harsh wilderness, trust was their only shield, but even that could be broken in a heartbeat. Dawn unveiled a world untouched by war, yet just as unforgiving. Mist curled through the trees, dampening the scent of pine and earth. The maiden's exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, but there was no time for weakness. Then, a sound, soft, pained, human. She turned, heart hammering, to find a figure slumped against the roots of an ancient oak. A knight, but not one of their own. His armor was foreign, marked by symbols she had been taught to fear. He was a pagan warrior, an enemy of her people, and he was bleeding. Compassion battled with caution as she stepped closer. His wounds were grave. Without aid, he would not see another sunrise. Yet aiding him meant defying everything she had ever known. The knight beside her tensed, his silence speaking louder than any command. The world they came from had no room for mercy, but the world they were trapped in demanded it. Could they leave him to die, knowing they carried the power to save him? Or was this forced alliance an inevitable bond woven by fate? The wounded knight stirred, his gaze flickering open, heavy with pain and distrust. He did not beg, nor did he reach for his weapon. He simply watched her, waiting for a verdict only she could give. The maiden's fingers curled around the fabric of her cloak, torn between logic and empathy. Every story she had been told whispered in her mind. He was the villain, the betrayer, the monster in the dark. But was he? Or was he simply another lost soul? Another piece of this shattered world seeking to survive? Her decision came not in words, but in action. Kneeling, she reached for his wounds, ignoring the silent protest of her protector. The knight beside her exhaled sharply, knowing there was no turning back now. Compassion was a dangerous thing in a land ruled by bloodshed, but perhaps in this moment, it was also the only thing that made them human. The wounded knight flinched, but did not resist. A silent bond was forged, not through oaths or duty, but through the simple act of saving a life. The forest seemed to breathe around them, as if acknowledging the shift in fate. The maiden worked quickly, her hands steady despite the storm raging within. The knight at her side remained vigilant, torn between his code of honor and the rules of survival. and as the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, the reality of their choice settled upon them. They were no longer just two against the world. Now, they were three, and that changed everything. The wilderness did not welcome them. It tested them. Every step forward was a battle against the land itself, against the merciless rivers that swallowed the weak and the beasts that prowled the night. The wounded knight was barely able to stand, his breath ragged as he leaned against the maiden's protector for support. Each mile they crossed, every silent exchange between them, deepened the unspoken truth. They were bound together now, not by allegiance, but by survival. And survival had no patience for old hatreds. The first challenge came with the rising waters. A river, swollen from the autumn rains, cut across their path like a blade of silver. There were no bridges, no fords, only the relentless current daring them to cross. The maiden hesitated, her instinct screaming of the dangers unseen beneath the surface. But hesitation was a luxury they could not afford. The knight who had sworn to protect her waded in first, his grip firm around her wrist. The wounded warrior followed, his strength failing, forcing them to bear his weight as the current fought to drag them under. Cold and exhaustion gnawed at their bones as they pressed on. Food was scarce, and what little they had was shared in silence, passed from calloused hand to trembling fingers. The maiden had never known hunger before, not like this. She had never felt the slow, creeping weakness that settled in one's limbs when the body had been pushed beyond its limits. Yet, in those moments of shared hardship, something unexpected grew between them. A fragile trust, an understanding forged in suffering. Not friendship, not yet, but something dangerously close. The dangers of man proved more ruthless than the perils of nature. Mercenaries stalked the roads, hunting those too weak to fight back. It was during one such encounter that the wounded knight, despite his failing strength, revealed his worth. When blades were drawn in the dim light of dawn, he moved with a precision that defied his injuries, cutting through their enemies with a quiet, brutal efficiency. The maiden watched, her heart hammering. He had been an enemy once, and yet, now, he bled for her. There was no time to question it, no time to wonder what it meant. They scavenged what they could from the fallen and disappeared into the trees before more could follow. As night fell, the three of them huddled close beneath a makeshift shelter of branches, the fire between them the only warmth in an unforgiving world. The knight who had once been their foe stared into the flames, his expression unreadable. The maiden saw something in his eyes, something she could not name. A grief too deep for words, a past lost to war. The morning came with new choices. The road ahead would not be easier, but the bonds between them had been tempered like steel and fire. What had started as a forced alliance had become something far more intricate, a connection neither of them could fully understand. Yet, the path was not infinite, and fate was relentless. The maiden's destination was near, and with it came the inevitable truth: they could not walk together forever. The road stretched before them, winding toward a fate they could no longer outrun. The maiden's destination loomed on the horizon, a fortress of stone and duty, where honor was measured in loyalty and not in the silent bond they had forged. The wounded knight had regained his strength, though the weight of his past still clung to him like an iron shroud. Her protector, ever watchful, felt the shift in the air, the unspoken realization that their journey together was nearing its end. Yet, endings were never so simple, not when hearts and fates had tangled in ways none of them could have foreseen. The final miles felt heavier than the battles they had fought. Words were few, stolen glances carried the weight of unspoken thoughts. The maiden knew what awaited her: duty, obligation, a life once mapped out before war had torn her world apart. And yet, the thought of parting from the warrior who had once been an enemy, from the protector who had become more than just a shadow in the night, unsettled her in ways she could not name. The wilderness had tested them, shaped them, forced them to rely on one another. Could the walls of her home undo what the wild had forged? As they neared the gates, banners of her house came into view, fluttering against the cold wind. It was a reminder of who she was supposed to be: a noblewoman, a daughter of a once great lineage. But in the depths of her heart, something had changed. She had faced mercenaries, braved the harsh wilderness, and made choices that defied the teachings of her upbringing. The world inside those walls did not know of survival beyond privilege. They did not know what it meant to see humanity in a man branded an enemy. Would they ever understand? The knight who had protected her all this way turned to her, his expression unreadable. He had done his duty, fulfilled the oath sworn in another lifetime. And yet, there was something unspoken in his stance, a hesitation that had not been there before. Perhaps he, too, wondered if all they had endured would simply fade into memory. The wounded warrior, once their adversary, stood apart, his gaze fixed beyond the horizon. His road did not end here. He had survived where he should have perished, but what future awaited him now? Could he return to a world that no longer had a place for him? The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain. The choice was not hers alone. The weight of honor pressed upon them all, demanding that each follow their destined path. But honor was not always simple. Honor did not erase the past nor the feelings that had formed in the space between life and death. And so, as the maiden stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the world she once knew, she did not look back. Because if she did, she knew she might never be able to let go. Yet, as the heavy gates closed behind her, a truth lingered in the silence. No road was ever truly final. Fate had brought them together once, and in a world where kingdoms rose and fell like the tides, who was to say it would not do so again?